Veteran Rickford Bertsch was born December 21st, 1949. He served in the Vietnam War. His highest rank was Petty Officer 3rd Class. This interview took place on December 2nd, 2012 at the Veterans Home. Lauren Owens, Mary Dawson, Emily McEwen, Adair Savoya, and the veteran's daughter, Tara Bertsch, carried out the interview. This interview is being conducted for the Da Vinci High School America at War project and is to be archived in the Library of Congress.
So I was born in Decatur, Indiana. It's a town just 20 miles south of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Very made up of German farmers, very isolated. We really weren't that much a part of what was going on the various coast. You know, the East Coast, New York, the big city. And as I was growing up, there was a lot of tension with my family, with my parents, especially my father. Very domineering German type personality. And basically I wanted to go to school. He wasn't that really school oriented. He was more factory oriented. And my goals was to go to college and basically get away from home. That was my chief goal, was just to leave home. And the easiest way of doing that was to join the military. And so that was the reason why I joined the Navy. At the time, when I graduated from high school in 1967, Monmouth High School was the name of the high school. I left there. During the summer I got a job in a diamond die factory, and I worked there for a few months. And basically diamond dies are devices that are about the size, about that big around. I don't know if you've ever seen a pressure cooker, and they have a little device that you put on top of the pressure cooker that helps release steam if there's too much buildup in the pressure cooker. But it was something that size, about an inch in width and maybe the size of $1, but embedded in that is a diamond, and you would pull wire through that you could make to any size. Ironically, some of the wire that was used was to make hypodermic needles, which I'm a veterinarian now. These syringes and needles I would come to use, but I essentially made the device that allowed for the production of those hypodermic needles. So that's in terms of my schooling and everything. I was in high school, and I worked for a few months, and I needed to get away from home. So I joined the Navy essentially when I was 17 years old. It was something called the 90-day delay plan. I joined in October of 1967. They allowed you to still remain at home for 90 days. And then I officially was inducted on December 28th, 1968, or 1967. That was my induction. I had just turned 18.
So did you go through a special training?
Well, initially interestingly, you have all these iconic pictures of people traveling by train from World War II, and that's how I got there's a song called 20 Years Ago that was written and sung by Kenny Rogers. That's exactly what happened to me. I literally left the house. I can still remember leaving my house that morning, December the 28th. It had been warm. We had a tornado that season, and then the cold front moved in, and everything became frozen. It was exceptionally cold. Cold morning. My father drove me to Fort Wayne. From there I took a train to Indianapolis, and that's where I was inducted. And that's where everybody was processed. All these people were just like cattle moved through, and you had examinations and physical examinations to see that you would be okay, that you get classified that way. And then you went on to all these people were together, and then they went on to their various services, the Coast Guard, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines. I actually had two classmates in high school that joined the Marines. One died in Vietnam, and the other one, when he came home, he never really married after that. So He was a Marine, so they were actually on the ground. I had joined the Navy. So from there I was flown from Indianapolis to Chicago, and then I did boot camp for 11 weeks at Great Lakes Training Center. And again, it was exceptionally cold. Usually when you finally wind up at your final destination, it's usually 3 in the morning, you're freezing. We just had light wearing apparel. They gave us our initial uniform that we would wear, dungarees, and 2 wool blankets. And we were set up in this brick barracks. And that's how it initially started. Eventually they would transfer us to a regular dorm, but some people got pneumonia there. I can remember, just because of how cold it was, and then you went through your training. The training was just, a lot of it was marching and exercises, but you also were taught military and naval etiquette, and so that you would know how to act on board ship, and also the hierarchy, where you fit, what was your role, and with all the other people that were there, and who you saluted and who you didn't salute, and that type of thing. The one thing I remembered from boot camp was that you had to follow certain rules, and I can remember being, again, woken up at 2 or 3 in the morning, freezing cold, and you did your own laundry by hand, and we had put our laundry out on a line, and there weren't clothespins as such. You actually had little clothesline ties, pieces of string that held the clothing on the line, and they all had to be perfectly lined up. And for some reason, one of them was off a little bit, so we had to take everything off the line, even though our clothesline string was frozen to the line. So,
is it true that sometimes people in the military will not start changing their clothes because they don't want to mess up and have to refold everything? Did you go through that?
I forget how many people, as you enter, you're in a group, it's called a company. There were maybe 100 people to a company, I forget now, it's been 45 years, but there were 6 urinals. We were only allowed to use 1, because we wanted to keep the other 5 spotless for inspection purposes. Yeah. So that made it fun.
Of course. So you said you were on an aircraft carrier. What was your role?
Well, then after we got through boot camp, managed to get through that. I went home for a week, and then I was sent. You get orders, and then of course I asked for Boston. I had this romantic idea of what the Navy was about, and that's where the U.S. Constitution was ported. And I was thinking I'd go to Boston. I'd spend 4 years on the East Coast, having fun, but it was the Vietnam conflict now, and Johnson had just managed to create the Vietnam Resolution, which allowed him unlimited power to call up as many people as he wanted. So now we're talking like 200,000, 100,000, 200,000 men that were called up, and and also, I don't even remember, but during that same time, there was the incident where there was still a conflict with North Korea, and it was a time when we were actually in basic training. The Pueblo had been taken captive, the people on the Pueblo. It was an intelligence ship. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the USS Pueblo.
I've heard of different USSs,
okay.
But not the Pueblo.
So that happened at the same time. And again, this was in a time of communist movement. You had talk of the domino effect. So basically, we were worried about countries like Vietnam falling to communism and the communist. And so that was our basic concern, and that's why we were supporting South Vietnam.
Were you on any of the Maddox that were...
So the Turner Joy and the Maddox was attacked, and that gave the Johnson the trigger, the kind of like the spark that gave him the power to to come up with this Vietnam resolution that allowed him to call up all these people.
The joint resolution, yeah.
And so with that, they just needed people, they needed manpower, and so I was sent to what is known as the Western Pacific, and I was assigned the USS Ranger, and at that particular time they were getting close to finishing one of their cruises. And so I was flown to Tachikawa Air Force Base, stayed there, got on a cargo plane. It was the first time I ever rode a plane where you were actually sitting against the bulkhead, looking at the mid part of the plane, and with this big mountain of mail, and they basically took us to the Philippines. And there we stayed at Clark Air Force Base, and then eventually they bussed us down to the Subic Bay, and that's where I was going to meet up with the USS Ranger. So the first time I'd ever seen the ship, people came off the ship and collected all of us new recruits, new people that were going to be, by this time I was what is known as a seaman apprentice, and somebody came up to me and they said, what would you like to be? Would you like to go join the ship is divided up into divisions, and each department or division has their own particular job to do, and they basically asked me, which division would you like to join? Weather department, meteorology, or would you want to be a radarman? So for some strange reason I decided to be a radarman. So that would be my job on the ship, working in Combat Information Center, CIC, where you see a lot of, in the movies, you see these people with all these status boards and working at these computer radar scopes. And at that particular time, they were just introducing something new called NTDS, which is Naval Tactical Data Systems, which was probably through Howard Hughes, all this particular equipment. But it was all computerized. Before it was just a radar screen, and you would see radar images on a screen, and then you would just report it to the people on this one particular ship. Now you could link up with other ships and pass information about positions and locations of enemy aircraft or other ships, unknown ships, to other ships in the area. And that was part of the NTDS, and so all of this information was computerized. But there were different aspects to Combat Information Center and what radar people did. There was a surface section which watched for just the surface area, and your horizon, it depended upon your surface radars and the resolution they had. And I can't remember, maybe 50 miles or something like that, or maybe 20 to 50 miles, whereas your air portion of the system allowed you to monitor aircraft that were coming in maybe 100 to 200 miles. Because of the curvature of the Earth, the radar went off, although you would get something known as bounce, where certain radio frequencies would bounce off the atmosphere. And that was a part of the computerized information, because then you could attach a symbology to a particular unknown aircraft that was coming in, pass this to other ships that was beyond their radar range. So then that allowed you to do that and increase your defensive area. Unlike other ships that you may have read about during World War II or seen movies of, like the Franklin and things like this, they went through battles, the Battle of Midway, the Battle of Courtesy. Essentially, the ships went on cruises, and there was the Forrestal, the Oriskany, the Midway, the Hornet, the Enterprise, the Coral Sea, the Kitty Hawk, the Yorktown. All of these basically took turns, and we all did what are known as Western Pacific cruises, and you basically stayed in the Gulf of Tonkin for around 9 months of the year, and you might be out to sea for anywhere from 30 to 60 days at a time. And your job as an aircraft carrier, it was sort of the combination of to some people like a prison, because you couldn't go anywhere. You had access to anything you needed. If it wasn't with you at the time, you had no access to anything. Even the news, media, you're pretty much isolated. And it was kind of a combination of that and a floating factory, because basically your job was, the entire ship's crew's job was to keep these aircraft airborne and able to conduct their missions. So their missions were anything from reconnaissance to the bombing missions they went on, the targets they had to hit, or the support that they had to carry out for men on the ground. And so our job there was also one area of Combat Information Center where we had, this was usually done by first-class petty officers, that they had received enough training that was at their particular level of expertise. They basically talked to pilots, and so as we entered this particular place called Yankee Station, that's where we would group together the three or four carriers, and one carrier would be the lead carrier, and that carrier would carry the admiral. They carried on their job, their missions that they conducted from day to day, around the clock, taking turns with the other carriers and launching aircraft. Part of the job that was carried out in Combat Information Center, again, where the air control people would launch the aircraft. They were gathered together by the people that worked where I worked in CIC. They were all sequestered or marshaled together, and then they were shifted over to another frequency that was picked up on land where they were given their target information. And then they would be flown back. We would constantly find out their fuel states, and sometimes they would come back with what is known as hung bombs, or armaments that were possible that could still be fired. And so there was always the danger of crashing into the aircraft carrier, or these hung bombs. They usually had to try to deal with those, or try to somehow get rid of them and ditch the bombs in the ocean somewhere so that they wouldn't become a danger to the aircraft carrier itself when they landed. Mm-hmm. So there was that aspect, and then there was one other part was known as electronic countermeasures, ECM, and a big role that they played was actually every radar had its own fingerprint, so they would actually go around and monitor radars. Sometimes the aircraft would kind of tease the enemy into turning on their radar, and so then they could actually fingerprint and catalog all the types of radars that there are. So that was another part of what went on in Combat Information Center.
Yeah, did the aircraft carrier ever dock, and did you get off?
Then, so you would do that. So then we had our different ports that we would visit, mm-hmm. and the basic ones were, the three basic areas was Hong Kong, Japan. In Japan it was Sasebo and Yokosuka. If we went to Yokosuka, we were close enough that we could go to Tokyo and visit there. The ships were usually, once you were in port, they were set up so that you either had 2 parties or 3 parties. If there were 2 parties, it was what is known as port and starboard, so that there was always half the ship's crew on the ship at all times, and the other half would leave. And you had what is known as Cinderella Liberty. You'd have to be back by midnight. And for Japan, a lot of the local areas were basically bars that a lot of the sailors would visit. And but there were a lot of people would go on trips to visit a lot of spots. I went to a couple of spots, Kamakuri. There were a lot of Buddhist shrines, these iconic shrines that you would see. Tokyo was an ultra-modern city. Department stores that were far ahead of us in the late 60s, more so than our own department stores. Mm-hmm. Restaurants. They would actually show models of the food that you would eat. They'd have little models in the window, so you could just point to what you wanted to eat. You knew exactly what it looked like. Yeah. And so that was all interesting. Japan was ahead of its time in terms of electronics, even in those days. So this is where you'd want to go and buy cameras and electronics and sound gear. So this was back in the 60s when rock and roll was coming into being, and folk songs and a lot of music and and it was no longer just the little portable record player that everybody had that played 45s and 78. Now you would buy amplifiers, turntable speakers. Hong Kong was noted for a place where you could go and buy cheap suits or inexpensive suits. So a lot of the guys would take off, and during the time, Tuesday I'd have off, and I'd go over there, and they'd find a place. Maybe it might be their last cruise, and now they're getting out. They're going to be discharged from the Navy. This will be the last cruise they made, the last chance that they'd be going to Hong Kong, and they would find a tailor where they would make these inexpensive suits that you'd probably pay 3 times as much money in the States. Mm-hmm. And then Hong Kong had a lot of interesting areas, a lot of beautiful restaurants where you would eat food that typically you couldn't afford in the United States. It was a British colony, and so you meet a lot of British soldiers there, and you'd hang out at a bar somewhere and discuss what you did.
Mm-hmm. How did the civilians treat you?
In Hong Kong, it was kind of people kind of went about their own business. Mm-hmm. In Japan, we were able to visit the palace, the Diet Building, which is their parliament, and there we'd run into high school kids, and they'd actually ask for your autograph. Hmm. But in the Sailor District, the Red Light District, the people there were pretty much business only, not necessarily that friendly. One of the traditional things that sailors would get would be what is known as a hot sea bath. So you would go and you get this special bath. And I don't know if you remember, there were these steam cabinets. So they kind of went through this, they'd run all these people through, and so that was kind of something that you could tell all your friends at home that you had you went through this, getting this particular bath. And then the Philippines was another place entirely. That was like a home away from home. And some people actually kind of set up pseudo-families over there. Hmm. And to me, it was like paradise on earth. And that's where we spent most of our time, too, when we were in port, was Subic Bay. The city that was there was known as Olongapo City. And the place that I spent most of my time was an island called Grandy Island. And it still had the remnants, the artifacts, the old buildings from World War II, so you could visit all those. But as sailors and somebody from another country, you basically wanted to stay on the base. A lot of guys would venture out. You could go on a lot of sightseeing tours, but it was best to be with people. If you wandered off alone, there were actually sailors that we know of that were beheaded. Wow. There were a lot of gangs in Olongapo. One was known as the Bahalagan. They sort of had their own territories. I didn't know it, but I had a friend that told me once that did you know you were shot at? And see, eventually, I don't know if you know it, the Philippines would go into martial law under Marcos. The one thing that stood out in my mind was growing up as a kid, we had something, a 57 Ford, and the only thing you saw in the Philippines were these old Jeeps called jeepneys that were left over from World War II, and they would be painted up in all these dazzling colors and with all these shiny objects that would be hanging from them, and a lot of them were used for taxi service. And that's basically how you got around. But I remember in this one particular street, there was this 57 Ford sitting there, and in the rear window was a shotgun. So usually people that had any wealth at all or actually could afford their own car, usually they could afford people that would act as guards and things like that. So it was mainly the people were poor there, and some of the people that some of the sailors, some of the people that were on the ship would actually re-enlist just for duty in the Philippines, because you could live essentially like a king there. Eat all you want and live any way you wanted, and the weather was beautiful, and it was like paradise. I know it was the first time I had ever visited there. And growing up as a family, we took all our trips together, and I actually felt guilty when I was on this one particular beach with all these palm trees and everything, and for being there and not having my family with me to see this or to share this. But still, it was a rough place to actually live in the Philippines, as it is now. And but one of the areas that I'd always wanted to go to, or that I would always visit, every time we'd pull in, I'd head over to this place called Grandy Island, and you could do a lot of diving. Okay. In your question, you're bringing up any danger involved, and I mean, the only time probably that we were in danger ashore was again because of the gangs and everything that was going on in the Philippines at the time. There were these people, I don't know their full name, but they were the shortened term for them were known as the Hucks. These were people from World War II that were supposed to have been paid certain amounts of money or bonuses that never got paid, and they actually joined the communist movement in the Philippines. So you always had to be careful in that sense. So you usually went around in groups. You never ventured out alone. But a lot of people would actually rather than getting their leave, you're allowed 4 weeks leave a year, rather than taking your leave in the States, some people would actually spend their leave in the Philippines just because of the lifestyle there. Aboard the ship, and originally there were 2 cannon or guns, artillery guns, gun turrets, and they actually removed one. There was one left, your basic defense for your aircraft. And the fighter airplanes, originally we had F-8s, and then eventually they went to the F-4 Phantom. You would always have 2, while you were on station, you'd always have at least 2 fighter aircraft in the air. So if we were ever attacked by MiGs or anything like that, because the Chinese had MiGs that would come down and fly down towards us, they would go out and meet those. The only other danger would be the danger from the bombs because we were a floating arsenal, would be from the bombs themselves. Mm-hmm. I think it was the Oriskany that actually had a Tomahawk rocket go off. It took out 3 decks of the aircraft carrier. A lot of people died from that. Fire was a major threat, and one time we did go to abandoned ship because of fire that was on board. So literally when you went, where you ate was known as the mess hall, and literally you would be eating food while we were on station with bombs sitting there, 500-pound bombs sitting where you were eating, or pass through because they would have to be taken from the holds that they were in, where they were kept and stored, and they were taken up to the hangar bay, and then up to the flight deck where they were put on the aircraft. So a lot of it was, the danger was from yourself, essentially. Mm-hmm. And you had to be careful during flight operations. People had gotten sucked into aircraft. They got too close and got sucked into aircraft. Also, when the aircraft land, they're caught by something known as an arresting gear. You may have heard of the airplanes having something known as a tail hook. And there were 3 gears. It's a cable that stretches across the width of the aft or back part of the aircraft carrier. And they have to catch these when they land. When they land, they're going full throttle up, because if they miss or something happens and they have to continue on, they have to be going full speed so that they can launch again off the aircraft deck. Sometimes the cables would break, and if you were unfortunately in the way, it could easily cut a man in half. They get wrapped around the island. The way the structure was consisted, the hangar bay, the hangar deck, where the planes were kept below the flight deck, was 3 levels down. That was considered the first deck. All the decks, as you went down further into the bottom part of the ship, it went 1 through 12, however many decks there were. And as you went up, it began as the O1 deck, or the O1 level. And the island went up to maybe the O9 level. We lived on the O3 level, and our ceiling was the flight deck. So you would hear, and we would work 8 on, 8 off. So the time during the day when you would sleep cycled and varied every other day. Maybe every other day would you actually sleep at what would be considered night, although we never saw the outside of the ship unless there wasn't flight ops going on, and you would go up there on the flight deck itself and kind of walk around and get some fresh air. Otherwise, you were below ships. There were no windows, no portholes to look out of below deck where we were up to the O3 level, and that's where the back part of the ship is where all the enlisted men were berthed or slept, and it was by division. So all the people that were in our division were kept together there.
How much space did you have to sleep?
It's hard, Tara and I visited the Hornet, and I think it was a smaller ship than USS Ranger CVA-61. That was the ship that I was on. It might have been smaller than that, but perhaps a room like this, and maybe 60 people. And that's the other aspect of the ship. The Navy's very traditional. The officers were berthed up front, maybe 2 to 3 people to a room, whereas we were kept in 60 people to a room. There were bunks, and everything that you owned was kept in your little locker, which is basically your uniforms. You weren't allowed to bring on any personal items, even baseball gear. The ship provided you with baseball equipment, so you really didn't buy. Some people might have had a ball glove or something like that, but you didn't. And your camera stuff, and sometimes people would find a place to keep record players and electronic gear, but most of it was hidden away. You didn't really have any personal gear, only what you could fit in your own locker at that bunk. And there would be 6 people to a cubicle, and the space in between would be that wide, and you had to make prior arrangements so that if you went to general quarters, who was going to be jumping on the floor first and getting ready if you were all asleep at the same time in those 6 bunks to get to general quarters, because at general quarters everybody had a particular post, so no one was asleep during general quarters. And general quarters could last for maybe, to get into general quarters, that could last for maybe 3 days at a time. So you were awake the entire time you were at GQ, and everybody had a post that they stayed at, and so that's basically where we slept. The ratings, that's how our enlisted men were. Rather than having a rank, it was known as a pay grade or a rating, E1 through E9. The E1s to E4s slept in their own particular area. The E5s and E6s, the second class and first class petty officers, had their own particular berthing area. And then the chiefs stayed in a whole different area on the ship. So everything, there was a very discrete hierarchy. And the higher up you went, your promotion and everything, there was the, as they say, rank has its privileges, and the person at the bottom usually was not considered to be of very much value. So,
what was your?
Well, I started off as an E2 seaman apprentice and seaman, then I became a third class petty officer, which was an E4. If I wanted to re-enlist, I could work my way up further if I wanted. Some people had gone to school already in radar. it was like a 1 or 2 year school, so they were already had a designation. Uh, so they were already designated in the particular area. At that particular time, they was known as radarmen. Now they're known as operations specialist. So rather than being a radarman third or radarman third class petty officer, now they're known as operations petty officers. And so that's basically how it worked. To give you an idea, when you first came on ship, all the lower people that first came on, they were assigned to galley duty, and that's where you basically worked in the mess hall. The ship was composed of 5,000 people, and they fed people around the clock, and that's where you learn that they could pretty much make you do whatever they wanted you to, and they could keep you up for as many hours as they wanted you to be up. Once you got by that, and as you were promoted, you were given more responsibility, and eventually you were in charge of other people. Mm-hmm. And so the last year I was on board, I spent my entire 3.5 years on the USS Ranger, and I became an E4, and then eventually I was in charge of other people. You had maintenance to do, or cleaning duties, or things like that. I would be in charge of a group of seamen, and I told them what to do. Mm-hmm. But that's basically what you did. Then on board ship, if you were in port, you had to stand sentry duty, so there would always be guards that would be walking up and down the pier, watching out for anyone that might try to get on board ship that was unauthorized. Mm-hmm. To give you another idea of the distinction between, say, the officer class and the enlisted men's class, there were 2 gangways, one for the officer and one for the enlisted men. So there was again a discrete distinction. In the early 60s, it still applied, but as time went by, more and more people were going to college. And to avoid Vietnam, the war itself, if you were in college, you would get a deferment so that you weren't drafted, because that was the major device. How many people wound up in service was through the draft. The key words were your draft number. Was it high or low? Did you know if you were going to be drafted? In my case, it was a way out for me, a way of getting away from home. I wanted to join the Navy. Mm-hmm. So I didn't pay any attention to a draft number or anything like that. And again, we're getting back to these people that were in college. Eventually, they wound up being on board ships. So you would actually, the distinction between the officers were these were college graduates that went on and joined the officer corps, and would come aboard as ensigns, and then lieutenant junior grades, lieutenants, and possibly work their way up. Mm-hmm. And they were pretty much in charge of everyone, and they would give orders to some people who maybe had a more advanced college education than the officers did. So there would be a lot of conflict, and this was a time of a lot of conflict. This was the time during the Civil Rights Movement and the protests that were going on. So people were not afraid to question the times.
Mm-hmm. Did anyone, any of your friends, try to avoid the draft?
No one that I knew of in Indiana. And I mean, the people there were very. They took it as your duty, but as again, there was this call up of 100 to 200,000 people. It's like it's like making a salad. You're suddenly mixing all these people together, and all these new ideas come together. And now we lived in an area where I grew up, and it was basically everyone was white in our high school. So now you're mixing with blacks. You're sleeping together, working and sleeping together with blacks, and you're going to cities like our home port was Alameda. So when you were at your home port, you would be visiting a city. For a lot of people coming from Midtown USA, the farm areas, they were introduced to new ideas and concepts, and so there was a lot of mixing of ideas, and probably one of the major problems that came out of that was the whole drug culture, because I'm sure a lot of the military personnel being stationed in these areas, these cities like the Bay Area, introduced this back to their hometown where maybe the drugs had never been heard of yet, where no one ever thought of anyone using drugs yet.
So you're saying that the people on board, like the military personnel, would bring back drugs from the places that you visited?
There were people that had gotten out of college and where drugs had been introduced there, and now they're on board ship, and it's the whole wave of protest and everyone questioning what was going on in society at that time, and remembering that people were drafted, so they were being forced to be in places where they never wanted to be, and we were questioning the whole war to begin with by the late 60s and early 70s. I think that it helped spread it helped spread the drug culture that was at that particular time, and helped.
Did you ever question the war being?
I thought about it, but the people on ship, that passed through my mind. But then a lot of my friends were mainly gung-ho, and a lot of us were into our jobs, and regardless of what your philosophy was, everybody did their job, and they tried to do it as best they could. So there was a certain amount of you didn't want to screw up. You wanted to make sure you did everything correctly. Although there were certain groups of people, I think one particular time we were in port and our ship wasn't able to leave on time because somebody had sabotaged some engineering space. So literally, people who were ready to head out to sea, for many of my other shipmates that were ready to leave and had spent all their money, suddenly they had opportunities to go back on shore, but they didn't have the money to spend or anything. So that was kind of the situation there that, and I can't remember whether it was in the Philippines or Japan that had occurred, but the same way there were people protesting and actually lying in front of railroad tracks in Alameda, in front of trains that were carrying rockets and missiles and bombs and things like that. So there were some people that were a part of that and were more aggressive and took it more seriously.
Did it anger you that they're disrupting like your services, or did it not really feel?
No, I didn't know whether I was torn between whether maybe they were right and I'm wrong, but I just went on to carry out the duties. But it created a situation where morale was low, because everybody wanted to get out, and there would always be complaining behind the scenes, and even the people like the first class petty officers, who had a number of years of training in electronics, in radar, and those particular areas, they were being coached away by private firms where they could get paid more. So there were a lot of people at the higher levels. To give you some idea, when we would leave the ship, we would pull in port in the States, and we would leave the ship and we would travel around the Bay, gather and walk around the Bay Area and visit, especially going to Berkeley. And there you didn't wear your uniform. You would actually have special lockers set up that you kept and paid somebody to keep even while you were over in Western Pacific. But it was so that when you got in port, you could go to the locker and put on civilian clothes, because you wouldn't want to be caught with your uniform on in the Bay Area at that time, just because of all the protesting and just the way people felt about military people, because they just basically assumed everyone was, if you were in a uniform, then you were for the war. and it was kind of like, even the question of the pilots themselves, who actually dropped the bombs, we would question their motives, but for some of those people, the officers that flew the aircraft, these were multi-million-dollar aircraft. They were flying the most sophisticated aircraft ever built at that time, and they had the opportunity, and they basically just wanted to fly. So even for them, it was an opportunity to fly these super sophisticated aircraft, and not necessarily be doing it because they were involved in a war, let's say.
When someone did get in trouble, like on board, what was the different?
For an example, people would, if they would do something on board ship, you could get court-martialed, and you would go to the brig. Every ship had a Marine detachment, and the Marines basically watched the prisoners, and they would escort them through the ship if they have to go from one place to another. So you could be put in a brig while out at sea for maybe whatever your sentence was. Every ship had what is known as the master of arms, and that was kind of like the sheriff on board ship, the chief master at arms. One interesting thing was you could possess guns, but you could never keep them with you. They were kept in a special, what is known as a gun locker. When you would arrive in port, you could check out your gun. So even though we were military personnel, only the Marines had guns that they carried with them. But so that was basically what would happen if you did something wrong on board ship, or you didn't follow out your duties. Probably one of the most stressful areas was when the ship would leave the United States. It would have to go through something known as carrier qualifications, and that's when you would stay up 3 days at a time. And for some reason, they felt you could stay awake for 3 days at a time. They always made sure that you had plenty of food to eat, but if you happened to fall asleep on post, you could actually get court-martialed and be demoted and be reduced in pay grade. So that was a very serious thing. And that was one of the ways you'd wind up in the brig, or for not being able to stand watch. They didn't really, being drunk or drinking, you weren't allowed to drink aboard ship, but that was totally overlooked when you were on board ship. If you came back, when you went ashore in a particular port, it was known as going on the beach, and if you did something wrong, usually people looked the other way. On the other hand, if you were like in the Philippines, people that came back sunburned and they couldn't perform their duties because they were sunburned, they could actually get court-martialed for that.
Wow.
Just to give you an idea of the distinction between the two. Drinking, it was sort of part and parcel of the life and culture of being a sailor.
Did you make any friends and long-term friends that you kept?
I know people that would join the Army, you usually go in with someone else and you would get assigned to the same unit. I was basically alone, so you would always find somebody and meet someone, and so you would develop friendships on board ship. I even have a picture of one particular person. We were actually going to, when we got out of the Navy, we were going to stay in the Philippines and become the rice kings of the Philippines.
Mm-hmm. Did you retrieve any medals or do you have any other pictures of yourself on board?
Somewhere, I received one written award. It's kind of like a certificate. Mm-hmm. But other than that, you received ribbons and medals for the duties you performed based on the fact that you were aboard that ship and you were in a particular area.
Do you have any of those with you?
So this is the uniform. This is what you're issued. And this is your dress blue uniform. You have dress whites and dress blues. And so this is the dress blues. And there's a lot of tradition that goes into the uniform itself. This is known as piping back there. The way you wear the pants, it's buttoned up like this. They're bell bottoms, and traditionally there's 13 buttons. Okay, and the joke being that if you in a hurry, you can go like that, and you wanted to get your pants off really quick. So, but that's the tradition there, again, being the 13 buttons. And I know, and then your necktie, and I remember that when I went home, I actually ironed this like this, and this is the way it stayed the entire time I was in the service. And some people would do theirs, and it would kind of fling out like that. It wouldn't lay just like that, so a lot of people would borrow it from me. In terms of the ribbons now, these are things that you're issued as you're in the Navy, and you're expected to wear those if you have an inspection. So aboard that ship, everyone that was on ship received these, and there are medals that go with each one of the ribbons, and that's a couple of them there. Oh, so, and to be honest, I'd have to look up what they actually. I mean, one was sort of an expeditionary medal ribbon, and this is the traditional. This particular one is the traditional ribbon that you would see, or insignia that you would see on a lot of cars that would denote that that particular person was a Vietnam veteran. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've ever seen those.
No.
No. Someday you might look at a automobile and it'll have that insignia on it, and basically what that person is telling everybody is that I'm a Vietnam vet. So, and so that's basically the uniform, and this indicates that I'm a radarman, and now it's operations personnel. This is known as a crow, and when you become an E4 and you get your first chevron, tradition is that they have to tack on your crow, so everybody in the division comes around and hits you in the arm. Interestingly, that similar thing happened to people who were former Navy people, and this one particular person took this other person to court because they were mailmen now, and when one person got demoted, the other guy hit the first person in the arm, and so he was charging the other guy with assault. And he was saying, well, we're both Navy people, we did this in the Navy. And then when he went to court, like the People's Court, the judge, who was a former Navy person, said, I never heard of that. tacking on your, it's called tacking on your crow. And all I could think of was, what Navy was he in? But, so that's kind of what the uniform is about. When we were in the Philippines, we wore whites, which stayed white for about 5 minutes because it was so hot and humid.
Yeah, do you want to take a seat again?
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's... Okay.
So at this time, maybe you're headed back home. Do you go home, or are you, when you're in the States? Are you like...
I think I went home maybe. I spent 2 leaves at home.
Okay.
So each year you'd get 4 weeks off, and I think twice I went home in the 3.5 years.
And when the war was over, like, how did everyone like take you back? Like, what was it like?
So the Vietnam conflict probably lasted like 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So that I was discharged in 1971, so it was still going on, and there were even friends of mine that were still aboard ship. As a matter of fact, I had to, I think, vouch for somebody in terms of clearance, and
Why were you discharged?
so your enlistment was typically for 4 years.
Okay.
Because as a matter of fact, since I needed so many people, it was reaching a point where they were allowing people to be in for 2 years, but giving them 4 years of college tuition free. For me, I enlisted for 4 years to get 4 years of college tuition, which was one of the reasons why I joined it. Not only to get away from home, but it would help pay for college under what was then known as the GI Bill. So that was another reason. Maybe to give you a little idea of what, I don't know if I mentioned it, but essentially the aircraft carrier would, our home port would be Alameda, and we would stay there for 2 to 3 months, and we would do a minor maintenance there, and then the ship would go over for like 9 months and be at Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin, and then we'd come back for another 2 months. This would get people to actually see their families again and spend time in the States, and for the ship to be overhauled, and then it get orders again to go back. But every 4 years it would go through a major overhaul, and this would be done, I think that before I had gotten on board ship, it was the overhaul just before then was Bremerton, and then Washington, and then when we came back, that particular cruise, in the 1970-1971 cruise, the last cruise that I was on the ship for that particular one, they were just going into a major overhaul there, and that was conducted in Hunter's Point. And that's where they actually take the ship, take it out of the water, put it in dry dock, and now you could actually see the entire ship. I remember we had friends who took off and they came back and they were drunk, and they were coming back on board ship, and they said Jimmy fell into the dry dock, which was like, I don't know how many, 50, 100 feet down, and Jimmy turned out to be a billiard ball. They had just thrown a ball into the dry dock, but we thought somebody had actually fallen in.
Yeah, that would have been terrible. But when you did return home, did you have to like readjust to civilian life, or were you kind of used to that because of docking?
So like you're there, you're doing your job every day, and then all of a sudden, I think they did, a week before, they did take us to Treasure Island, and there, in case somebody wanted to go into, apply for a job as a mail person, to go there, and they were kind of doing examinations or running tests to see if you'd qualify for that, if you wanted to try and get a job as soon as you got out. So so there was a constant turnover, people entering the ship and leaving the ship. So this was October of 1971 that I was officially discharged. As you were discharged, you had to visit all these different departments and be signed off. And I remember I didn't get a chance to go to this one department, and my best buddy just said here, and he signed it GOD. And that's what would happen. I was discharged. I went to the human resources, and I was working in a place that made shingles in Hayward, California, the following Monday. And it was like it didn't even exist. But the Bay Area was such that there were so many people there that are affiliated not only with the Naval Air Station, but they all had some relatives or some husbands, sons that were associated with the military and the Navy. So you never actually thought you got away from it, especially living on Alameda, which was basically a Navy town anyway. There were still the same bars that everybody went to, the same lockers that were there, and so you never really actually got away from the Navy. But once you were out, you were out. I could have joined the reserves, but it meant weekend duty, and I wanted to reserve all my time for college because I worked at this particular factory for 2 months just until the new quarter started, and then I went into college and lived off the GI Bill essentially.
And like reflecting back on your war experience, I was just wondering, like, were you affected by, like, mentally?
Extremely, but not in the case, not post-traumatic stress syndrome or something of that nature. It was just the whole idea at this particular time, because of everything that was going on, all the protests and the way society was at that particular time, and you're constantly asking yourself, or at least I was, how was this different than my father? World War II, there was a cause. People would jump at the chance to join the army or the military and fight in World War II. And the things that went on, because even places like the Philippines, the people there were treated like second-class citizens. It seemed to be a lot of needless killing, and there was no reason for it. And so that was just something that I lived with. And as time went by, and as people brought up the story of the war and Vietnam, and as more and more information came out afterwards, like the fog of war, you could kind of resolve what had happened. And besides that, after so many years, you kind of go on with your life, and you have new challenges and a lot of new things to worry about, and so that's sort of all. And there have been so many things that have happened since then. I forget the islands that we went into before Somalia. We were questioning then whether we, from that point on, every conflict that would come up, we would question whether we should be there or not. It was only until Iraq that, and Desert Storm that suddenly we felt good about our military. So.
Did you question Johnson's decision to, since you were on an aircraft carrier, you can feel for the men who were on the Maddox and the Turner Joy. Do you think that those were false accusations that they?
Oh, they could very well be.
Okay.
One of the things that I did when I was in the Philippines, I was a part of a group of people that were supposed to help build a school. So we went to this particular site, and we basically picked up a bunch of trash, but we never actually helped build anything. But a lot of people took a lot of pictures, so it was good PR.
So did you learn any life lessons from the military service when you were enlisted?
Well, you always have to question or be aware or wary of what people are asking of you, and the same thing now in terms of how we deal with other countries and whether we have a right to be there or not.
Yeah. So, if you have any other stories you want to tell or anything,
Let's see.
I think we're pretty good.
Yeah, if I missed anything there.
Any specific questions that you guys have?
Maybe best experience, or there was
Most
a
memorable
favorite,
memory.
yeah, most memorable or
Most,
favorite.
most memorable experience you had.
Just visiting all the places. That was the one thing about the Navy. It allowed you to go to places that you never dreamt you'd be able to go to, and you never really left home because your home was always there with you. And certainly I would never have gone to Hong Kong and Japan and visit all these places. Even now I've had opportunities to go to Japan, but it's just far too expensive. So being on a ship like that allowed you to travel to all these places and visit all these places. And there was some freedom there, but it was very restricted too. I guess another point was, as time went on, as you got into by 71, things had changed so much. When you were on board ship, you weren't allowed any civilian clothes. As an enlisted man, only the officers wore civilian clothes off the ship, and the chiefs. And so when you left the ship, you would always leave in uniform, and then that's why you had to go to these lockers to get civvies if you were going to travel or visit the Bay Area. And but by the end of by the fourth cruise, by 71, there was a new chief of naval operations called Admiral Zumwalt, and he would issue these things called Z-grams, and there he increased the pay of the lower enlisted men just to keep people in because so many people were leaving, and the turnover was so great. And also they allowed you to actually have civilian clothes on board ship, and because of the dress code and people were having long hair, they allowed you to grow a beard. Prior to that, you always had to be clean shaven and a close haircut, and if you tried to leave the ship, whoever's what is known as the officer of the deck, they could easily deny you permission to leave. If you're on board ship, you're part of the working crew, whether you're in the Liberty section or not. And so usually if you had an opportunity to leave the ship, you always tried to get away. So there was these changes going on, and it was recognized by the people that were at the higher levels, and they knew changes. If the Navy was going to be able to maintain personnel with whom they did all this training, they would have to offer them better opportunities than what they had, and make life a little bit more inviting than the way it was when I initially entered the service.
Well, I don't have any other questions for you, but
Okay.
thank you for
Sure.
letting us interview you.
Okay.
It was really great.